In 1991, Iraq fired 42 missiles at Israel. Not a single Israeli soldier had set foot in Iraq. Israel wasn't even part of the war. So why did Saddam Hussein risk everything to attack them? What you're about to hear is the story of a dictator's obsession that nearly sparked World War III. This is the untold history of Saddam Hussein versus Israel. Most people think the Gulf War was just about Kuwait. They're wrong. Hidden beneath the surface was a decades-long vendetta that would put millions of lives at risk, and it all started with a single phone call in 1981. Let me take you back to June 7, 1981. Baghdad, Iraq. It's a Sunday evening and the sun is setting over the Tigris River. Saddam Hussein is in his presidential palace, surrounded by his advisors. They're celebrating. Just 3 days earlier, Saddam had given a speech declaring Iraq's new nuclear reactor, Osirak, as the pride of the Arab world. This reactor, built with French assistance, was supposed to put Iraq on the path to becoming a nuclear power. Saddam saw it as his ticket to regional dominance, his way of becoming the undisputed leader of the Arab world. Then the phone rings. The call comes from the military command center. The voice on the other end is panicked, barely coherent. The words that come through that phone line would change everything. The Osirak reactor has been destroyed, completely obliterated. Israeli F-16 fighter jets had flown over 1,000 kilometers, evaded Iraqi air defenses, and reduced years of work to rubble in less than 2 minutes. Saddam's face goes white, then red. His hands start shaking, not from fear, from rage, pure, unfiltered rage. The advisors in the room later said they had never seen him like that. He sweeps everything off his desk. Papers, phones, a glass of tea, all of it crashes to the floor. He's screaming now, screaming about betrayal, about humiliation, about revenge. This moment, this phone call, this is where our story really begins. Because from that day forward, Saddam Hussein became obsessed with one thing: making Israel pay. But to understand why this attack hurt Saddam so deeply, we need to go back even further. We need to understand who Saddam Hussein was and how he came to power in the first place. Saddam was born in 1937 in a small village called Al-Aja, just outside the city of Tikrit in northern Iraq. His childhood was brutal. His father disappeared before he was born, either dead or having abandoned the family. Nobody knew for sure. His mother remarried a man who treated Saddam terribly. His stepfather would beat him, force him to steal, and constantly reminded him that he was worthless. By the time Saddam was 10 years old, he ran away to live with his uncle, Kar al-Talfa. Now, this uncle was a former army officer who had been kicked out of the military for supporting a failed coup against the British-backed Iraqi monarchy. Kar al filled young Saddam's head with stories of Arab glory, nationalism, and hatred for foreign interference. He taught Saddam that power was the only thing that mattered in this world. Kindness was weakness. Mercy was for fools. Saddam absorbed these lessons like a sponge. By his early 20s, he had joined the Ba'ath Party, a political movement that believed in Arab unity and socialism. But Saddam didn't care much about ideology. He cared about power. In 1959, he participated in a failed assassination attempt against Iraq's Prime Minister, Abd al-Karim Qasim. Saddam got shot in the leg during the attempt and had to flee the country. He spent the next few years in exile, first in Syria, then in Egypt. During this time, Saddam learned an important lesson: violence works. The men who hesitated, who tried to play by the rules, they all ended up dead or in prison. But the men who were willing to do anything, to kill anyone, they were the ones who survived. Saddam decided he would never hesitate again. He returned to Iraq in 1963 after the Ba'ath Party briefly seized power. But that government fell quickly, and Saddam ended up in prison for 2 years. When he got out, he began his methodical climb to the top. He helped organize the 1968 coup that brought the Ba'ath Party back to power for good. His cousin, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, became president, and Saddam became vice president. But everyone knew who really held the power: Saddam controlled the security services. He built a network of spies and informants. He eliminated rivals, sometimes with a bullet, sometimes with a show trial, sometimes they just disappeared. By 1979, Saddam felt strong enough to make his move. He forced al-Bakr to resign and took the presidency for himself. What happened next sent a message to everyone in Iraq about what kind of leader Saddam would be. Just days after taking power, Saddam called a meeting of the Ba'ath Party leadership. Hundreds of party members gathered in a large hall, expecting a normal political assembly. Instead, they got a purge. Saddam stood at the podium smoking a cigar and announced that there had been a conspiracy against him. He began reading names from a list. As each name was called, security guards grabbed that person and dragged them out of the hall. Some of the men begged for mercy. Some maintained their innocence. Saddam just kept reading names. When he was done, 68 members had been taken away. Within days, they were executed. Saddam had forced other party members to participate in the firing squads, making them complicit in the murders. The message was clear: cross Saddam Hussein and you die. Now in complete control, Saddam turned his attention to his grand ambition, making Iraq the dominant power in the Middle East. He looked at the region and saw opportunity. Iran, Iraq's neighbor and rival, had just gone through a revolution. The Shah had been overthrown, and the new Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini was in chaos, with purges in the military and political instability everywhere. Saddam saw weakness. He thought he could invade Iran, seize some oil-rich territories, and establish himself as the strong man of the region. In September 1980, Iraqi forces crossed the border, starting what would become one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War would last 8 years, kill over 1 million people, and cost both countries hundreds of billions of dollars. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because in the middle of this war with Iran, Saddam had another project going on, a secret project that he believed would change everything. He was building a nuclear reactor. The Osirak reactor, also called Tammuz by the Iraqis, was purchased from France in the 1970s. Officially, it was for peaceful purposes, for nuclear research and medical applications. But everyone knew what Saddam really wanted: nuclear weapons. If Iraq had the bomb, no one could touch him. Not Iran, not Syria, and especially not Israel. Israel had been watching this development with growing alarm. Ever since its creation in 1948, Israel had faced existential threats from its Arab neighbors: multiple wars, constant terrorism, and the perpetual threat of being wiped off the map. Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, had a simple doctrine when it came to nuclear weapons in enemy hands: never again. They would do whatever it took to prevent another Holocaust, and a nuclear-armed Iraq absolutely qualified as an existential threat. The Israelis tried everything else first. They pressured France to cancel the deal. When that didn't work, they sabotaged equipment destined for Iraq. Mossad agents allegedly assassinated an Egyptian nuclear scientist who was helping Iraq. They bombed a warehouse in France where reactor components were being stored. But none of it was enough. The reactor was still being built, and it was getting close to operational status. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin faced an impossible decision. If he ordered an attack, he would be violating international law, potentially starting a wider war and facing condemnation from the entire world. But if he did nothing, Iraq might develop nuclear weapons within a few years. What would Saddam do with those weapons? Begin didn't want to find out. In the spring of 1981, Begin gave the order. The mission was called Operation Opera, though some called it Operation Babylon. The Israeli Air Force began training for what would be the longest and most dangerous bombing mission in its history. 8 F-16 fighter jets would carry out the attack, escorted by 6 F-15s for protection. They would have to fly over hostile territory for hours, avoiding detection, deliver their payload with perfect precision, and then make it home. If anything went wrong, the pilots would either die or be captured by Iraq, and the mission would fail. On June 7, 1981, the aircraft took off from Etzion Air Base in the Sinai Peninsula. They flew in tight formation, low enough to avoid radar but high enough to conserve fuel. The route took them over Saudi Arabia and Jordan, both countries that would have been very upset to know Israeli jets were violating their airspace. But the Israelis had planned carefully, exploiting gaps in radar coverage and timing their flight for maximum stealth. As they approached Iraq, the pilots climbed to attack altitude. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert. In the distance, they could see the distinctive dome of the Osirak reactor. It looked peaceful from the air, almost beautiful, reflecting the orange light of dusk. In a few minutes, it would be gone. The F-16s rolled in for their attack runs one after another. Each plane carried two Mark 84 bombs, 2,000-pound monsters designed to penetrate deep into concrete before exploding. The pilots released their weapons with textbook precision. 16 bombs fell toward the reactor. 14 of them hit their target. The explosions were massive. The reactor dome collapsed immediately. Secondary explosions followed as equipment and fuel inside the facility ignited. Within 2 minutes, years of work and hundreds of millions of dollars had been reduced to smoking rubble. One French technician was killed in the attack, the only casualty. The Israeli pilots turned their aircraft west and pushed their throttles forward. Time to go home. They made it back safely, every single aircraft. In Israel, the news was met with relief and celebration. They had done it. They had eliminated the threat. But they also braced for the international backlash they knew was coming. And it came hard. The United Nations Security Council unanimously condemned Israel. Even the United States, Israel's closest ally, publicly criticized the attack and temporarily suspended delivery of additional F-16 aircraft. France was furious. The Arab world exploded with rage and condemnation. Iraq demanded revenge. But it was Saddam's personal reaction that mattered most. Remember that moment in the palace when he got the phone call? That wasn't just anger at a military setback. For Saddam, this was deeply, intensely personal. He had been humiliated in front of the entire world. The reactor was supposed to be his crowning achievement, proof that Iraq was a major power. Instead, Israel had shown that Saddam couldn't even protect his most important facility on his own soil. In Arab culture, honor and shame carry enormous weight. Saddam had been shamed, and in his mind there was only one response: revenge. But he couldn't strike back immediately. He was bogged down in the war with Iran, his military was stretched thin, and he didn't have the capability to hit Israel directly. So he waited, and he planned, and his hatred grew. The Iran-Iraq War dragged on through the 1980s. It was a nightmare of trench warfare, chemical weapons, and human wave attacks. Saddam used poison gas against Iranian soldiers and against his own Kurdish population when they rebelled. Hundreds of thousands died for essentially no gain by either side. By 1988, both countries were exhausted, and a ceasefire was finally agreed upon. Saddam tried to present the outcome as a victory, but Iraq was economically devastated. The country was deep in debt, particularly to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had lent Iraq money during the war. Saddam believed these loans should be forgiven. After all, he argued, Iraq had been fighting Iran on behalf of all the Arab Gulf states, protecting them from the spread of the Iranian Revolution. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia disagreed. They wanted their money back. Saddam grew increasingly bitter. He had fought for 8 years, lost countless Iraqi lives, and destroyed his economy, and now the rich Gulf states were demanding repayment. He started to see Kuwait as an enemy, as an ungrateful neighbor stealing Iraqi oil through slant drilling across the border. His paranoia and megalomania, always present, kicked into overdrive. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait. The Kuwaiti military, tiny and unprepared, was overrun in a matter of hours. Saddam declared Kuwait to be Iraq's 19th province and began looting the country systematically. He thought the international community would grumble but ultimately accept his conquest. He was wrong. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, immediately condemned the invasion. Bush began assembling a massive international coalition to force Iraq out of Kuwait. Countries from around the world contributed troops, equipment, and support. Even some Arab nations like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria joined the coalition against Iraq. By January 1991, over 700,000 coalition troops were assembled in Saudi Arabia, preparing to liberate Kuwait. Saddam faced an impossible military situation. His army, battered from 8 years of war with Iran, now faced the most advanced military coalition ever assembled. American technology was a generation ahead of Iraq's Soviet-supplied equipment, but Saddam was a survivor, and he had a plan. Not a plan to win militarily, that was impossible, but a plan to survive politically and maybe even come out looking like a hero to the Arab world. The plan was simple: drag Israel into the war. If Saddam could provoke Israel into attacking Iraq, the Arab members of the coalition might withdraw. Many Arab populations were already uncomfortable fighting alongside Western forces against another Arab nation. But if Israel joined in, it would transform the conflict in Arab eyes from liberation of Kuwait into another Arab-Israeli war. Saddam could present himself as the defender of Arab honor against Zionism. So Saddam decided to attack Israel. Not because it made military sense. Israel wasn't even part of the coalition forces. Not because it would help Iraq's position in Kuwait, it wouldn't. But because Saddam saw an opportunity to split the coalition, and because, 10 years after the Osirak bombing, he still wanted revenge. Iraq's weapon of choice was the Scud missile. The Scud was an old Soviet design, a short-range ballistic missile that was notoriously inaccurate. But accuracy didn't matter for what Saddam had in mind. He wasn't trying to destroy Israeli military targets. He wanted to terrorize Israeli civilians and provoke a response. The message was, "You humiliated me in 1981, now I'm going to make you suffer." On January 17, 1991, the coalition began Operation Desert Storm with massive airstrikes against Iraqi targets. Saddam waited only hours before launching his retaliation. That night, air raid sirens wailed across Tel Aviv and Haifa for the first time since 1948. Scud missiles were incoming. Israeli families huddled in sealed rooms, wearing gas masks, terrified that the warheads might contain chemical weapons. Saddam had used chemical weapons before against Iran and the Kurds. Everyone knew he had them, and everyone feared he might use them against Israeli cities. The first missiles hit Tel Aviv around 2 a.m. The explosions shattered windows, collapsed buildings, and sent debris flying through the streets. Miraculously, no one was killed in that first attack, though several people were injured and dozens of buildings were damaged. More attacks followed over the coming days and weeks. Scuds fell on Tel Aviv, Haifa, and other Israeli cities, almost always at night, always without warning. The Israeli public was terrified and furious. Their government had the strongest military in the Middle East. The Israeli Air Force could reduce Baghdad to rubble. Why weren't they responding? Israeli generals presented plans to strike back, to send their aircraft to hunt Scud launchers in western Iraq, to show Saddam that you don't attack Israel without consequences. But the Americans were begging Israel not to retaliate. President Bush personally called Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir and pleaded with him to stay out of the war. Bush promised that coalition forces would hunt down the Scud launchers. He sent Patriot missile defense systems to Israel. He offered intelligence sharing and coordination. "Just please," he said, "don't give Saddam what he wants. Don't let him split the coalition." This put Shamir in an almost impossible position. The Israeli public was demanding action. His military was ready to go. Every instinct, every precedent in Israeli military doctrine said that when you're attacked, you hit back harder. Israel's entire deterrence strategy was based on overwhelming retaliation. But Shamir understood the bigger picture. If Israel attacked Iraq, the coalition might fall apart, Saddam might survive, and Iraq would remain a threat for years to come. The best chance for long-term Israeli security was to let the Americans finish this war quickly and decisively. So Israel did something it had never done before. It absorbed attacks and didn't respond. For 6 weeks, Scud missiles fell on Israeli cities and Israel did nothing. 42 missiles in total struck Israel. Thousands of buildings were damaged. 13 people died, one from a direct hit, the others from heart attacks or suffocating in their gas masks. Hundreds more were injured. Every missile attack was psychological warfare. The Scuds were inaccurate, you never knew where they would land. They came at random times, mostly at night. The air raid sirens would go off, and families had only minutes to get to their sealed rooms, seal the doors with tape, and put on their gas masks. Then they would wait, listening for the boom of an explosion somewhere in the city, wondering if the next one would hit their building, wondering if this missile carried chemical weapons. For context, imagine living in a city where, at any random moment, an alarm goes off, and you have to run to a special room, seal yourself in, and put on a gas mask, not knowing if a missile is about to destroy your home or release poison gas. Now imagine doing this night after night for 6 weeks. That was life in Israel in early 1991. Saddam was gleeful. He gave speeches on Iraqi television portraying himself as the great warrior striking blows against the Zionist enemy. He claimed every Scud launch was a victory. Iraqi state media showed footage of missiles launching, set to patriotic music, celebrating the attacks. In the Arab world, Saddam's popularity actually increased. Many Arabs, even those who didn't like Saddam, appreciated that someone was finally standing up to Israel and the Americans. But militarily, the Scud attacks were meaningless. They didn't slow down the coalition war effort at all. They didn't break Israeli morale, and they didn't cause Israel to enter the war. Saddam's strategy had failed. Meanwhile, the coalition's air campaign was systematically destroying Iraq's military. Coalition aircraft flew over 100,000 sorties, dropping bombs with unprecedented precision. Iraqi air defenses were dismantled. Iraqi command and control was shattered. The vaunted Iraqi Air Force barely put up a fight. Many Iraqi pilots flew their aircraft to Iran to avoid being destroyed on the ground. On February 24, 1991, the ground war began. Coalition forces, led by American and British armored divisions, smashed through Iraqi defenses in Kuwait and southern Iraq. What Saddam had predicted would be the mother of all battles turned into a one-sided rout. Iraqi forces retreated in chaos. The highway from Kuwait City to Basra became known as the Highway of Death, as coalition aircraft destroyed thousands of fleeing Iraqi vehicles. In just 100 hours, Kuwait was liberated. Iraqi forces were in full retreat, and Saddam's army was devastated. President Bush ordered a ceasefire. Coalition forces stopped their advance just short of Baghdad. This decision would be controversial and debated for years. Bush and his advisors decided that their mandate from the United Nations was to liberate Kuwait, not to occupy Iraq or overthrow Saddam. They also feared that occupying Iraq would be a quagmire, that it would fracture the coalition, and that removing Saddam might lead to Iraq breaking apart or Iran filling the power vacuum. So the war ended with Saddam still in power. He had lost militarily, lost Kuwait, lost much of his army, and his country was devastated. But he had survived, and in his mind, that was a victory. He immediately began spinning the narrative, claiming that Iraq had stood up to the entire world and survived. Iraqi propaganda portrayed Saddam as the hero who had challenged the Americans and lived to tell about it. But there were consequences. The UN imposed strict sanctions on Iraq, attempting to limit Saddam's ability to rebuild his military or develop weapons of mass destruction. UN weapons inspectors were sent into Iraq to search for and destroy any nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons programs. Iraq's military was forbidden from operating aircraft in large, no-fly zones in the north and south of the country, enforced by American and British jets. For all practical purposes, Iraq was under international quarantine. And what about Israel? The 42 Scud attacks had not been forgotten. In Israeli military and intelligence circles, Saddam was now seen as a unique threat, a leader whose hatred for Israel was so intense that he would launch attacks even when it made no strategic sense, even when it hurt his own position. This made him unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Israeli intelligence continued to track developments in Iraq throughout the 1990s. They knew Saddam was hiding things from UN inspectors. They knew he was trying to rebuild his military. And they assumed, based on his past behavior, that if Saddam ever got the chance to strike Israel again, he would take it. The relationship, if you could call it that, between Saddam and Israel was now defined entirely by mutual hostility. Saddam continued to give speeches condemning Israel and Zionism, promising that one day the Arabs would triumph. He gave financial rewards to the families of Palestinian suicide bombers who attacked Israeli civilians, paying $25,000 per attack, using Palestinian suffering as a tool in his own vendetta. Israel, for its part, maintained constant vigilance. If intelligence suggested Saddam was close to obtaining weapons of mass destruction again, there was no question Israel would strike first. The lesson of 1981 was clear: better to act and face international condemnation than to wait and face an existential threat. Through the 1990s, Saddam played a cat-and-mouse game with UN weapons inspectors. He would cooperate for a while, then obstruct them. He would allow inspections of some sites while hiding programs at others. It became clear that Saddam was determined to preserve some capability to develop weapons of mass destruction, even if he couldn't do so openly while sanctions were in place. Why did Saddam behave this way? Why not just fully cooperate with inspections, get the sanctions lifted, and rebuild Iraq's economy? The answer, according to documents and interrogations after Saddam's eventual capture, was a combination of pride, paranoia, and strategic calculation. Saddam believed that admitting he had no weapons of mass destruction would make Iraq look weak to Iran and to internal enemies. He wanted everyone, including his own generals, to believe Iraq might have hidden weapons. It was a bluff, a deterrent based on ambiguity. But the bluff would eventually backfire catastrophically. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States, the American government, now led by President George W. Bush, son of the president who had fought the First Gulf War, became obsessed with preventing terrorist groups from obtaining weapons of mass destruction. Iraq, with its history of WMD programs and its obstruction of inspectors, became a target. Despite no evidence linking Saddam to the 9/11 attacks, and despite ambiguous intelligence about Iraq's actual WMD capabilities, the Bush administration decided that Saddam had to go. The United States, this time with a much smaller coalition and without UN approval, invaded Iraq in March 2003. This time, the goal was explicit: regime change. Saddam Hussein's rule was over. The invasion itself was swift. American forces raced toward Baghdad, brushing aside Iraqi resistance. Saddam's regime collapsed in just 3 weeks. American troops pulled down statues of Saddam in Baghdad. His sons were killed in a firefight with U.S. forces. Saddam himself went into hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, protected by a small circle of loyalists. But he couldn't hide forever. On December 13, 2003, American forces, acting on intelligence, raided a farmhouse near Tikrit, Saddam's hometown. They found him hiding in a small underground bunker, what the Americans called a spider hole. The once powerful dictator, the man who had terrorized a nation and launched missiles at Israel, was pulled out of a hole in the ground, dirty and disheveled, with a long beard and no fight left in him. "I am Saddam Hussein," he said in English. "I am the president of Iraq and I am willing to negotiate." The American soldiers just stared at him. There would be no negotiation. Saddam was put on trial by an Iraqi court for crimes against humanity. specifically for ordering the killing of 148 Shia Muslims in the town of Dujal in 1982. The trial was chaotic, with Saddam ranting, refusing to recognize the court's authority, and at times being forcibly removed from the courtroom. But the verdict was never in doubt. On November 5, 2006, Saddam was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On December 30, 2006, in a building in Baghdad's Green Zone, Saddam Hussein was executed. Video of the execution recorded on a cell phone leaked to the internet. It showed Saddam in a black coat being led to the gallows. Even at the end, he was defiant. When the guards taunted him, he remained calm, even contemptuous. The noose was placed around his neck and the floor dropped away. Saddam Hussein was dead. And what about Israel? Throughout all of this, from the 2003 invasion to Saddam's capture and execution, Israel watched carefully but did not participate. There was no need. The Americans had done what needed to be done. The threat of Saddam Hussein was finally, permanently eliminated. Looking back at the whole story, from the 1981 bombing of Osirak to Saddam's execution 25 years later, what do we learn? Several things. First, we see how a single event, the Osirak bombing, created a personal vendetta that lasted decades. Saddam never forgot, never forgave, and when he had the chance in 1991, he lashed out at Israel even though it made no strategic sense. His hatred was that deep. Second, we see the limits of military power. Saddam had one of the largest armies in the Middle East in 1990. It didn't matter when faced with superior technology and training. The 1991 Gulf War was a demonstration that quantity can't always overcome quality. Third, we see the danger of ambiguity about weapons of mass destruction. Saddam's strategy of maintaining ambiguity about whether Iraq had WMDs was meant to deter enemies. Instead, it eventually provoked an invasion. The bluff didn't work. Fourth, we see how leaders' personalities matter. Saddam's paranoia, his cruelty, his pride, these weren't just personal flaws. They shaped his decisions and ultimately led to the destruction of his regime and his country. A different leader might have made different choices. Saddam couldn't. And finally, we see that Israel's policy of never allowing enemies to develop nuclear weapons, no matter the cost, has remained consistent. In 1981, they bombed Osirak. In 2007, they would bomb a suspected nuclear facility in Syria. They have made it clear that if Iran gets close to a nuclear weapon, they will strike. The doctrine established with Osirak remains in effect. The story of Saddam versus Israel is a story about hatred, revenge, miscalculation, and the consequences of leaders' egos. Saddam believed he could challenge Israel and survive. He was technically right. He did survive the 1991 war. But the chain of events he set in motion with the Scud attacks and his behavior afterward ensured that he wouldn't survive forever. When Saddam was hiding in that spider hole in 2003, waiting to be captured, did he think about Osirak? Did he think about those 42 Scuds he launched at Tel Aviv and Haifa? Did he wonder if things might have been different if he had chosen a different path, if he had let go of his vendetta, if he had focused on building Iraq instead of seeking revenge? We'll never know. What we do know is that the combination of Saddam's ambitions, his hatred of Israel, and his inability to assess his own limitations created decades of conflict that ended with him at the end of a rope and his country in ruins. The lesson here is stark. In international politics, revenge is expensive. Personal vendettas cost lives. And leaders who let their egos drive their decisions don't just destroy themselves, they destroy their countries too. Saddam Hussein wanted to be remembered as the great Arab leader who stood up to Israel and the West. Instead, he's remembered as a brutal dictator whose reign ended in total failure. For Israel, the threat of Saddam Hussein defined their security calculations for 2 decades. The 1981 bombing was controversial at the time, but is now seen as justified. The 1991 restraint in the face of Scud attacks was extraordinarily difficult, but was also the right call strategically. And the knowledge that Saddam was finally gone in 2006 brought genuine relief to Israeli leaders, even if they never said so publicly. Today, Iraq is a different country, still struggling, still dealing with the aftermath of Saddam's rule and the chaos of the 2003 invasion and its aftermath. But Saddam's particular brand of threat, his personal hatred for Israel, his willingness to attack Israeli civilians to satisfy his ego, that died with him. The story of Saddam Hussein versus Israel is a reminder that history is made by individuals making choices. Some choices create peace and prosperity. Other choices create war and destruction. Saddam made his choices, and he paid the price. So did the Iraqi people, so did the Kuwaitis, so did the Israelis who huddled in sealed rooms waiting for Scud missiles. Millions of people affected by one man's decisions. That's the reality of power. That's the weight of leadership. And that's why this story, this decades-long conflict between a dictator and a nation matters. It shows us what happens when leaders choose hatred over wisdom, revenge over reason, and ego over everything else. The results speak for themselves. Subscribe for more untold stories from history.